I'm delighted you're all here this evening to listen to the Pulitzer Center's 2012 Persephone Meal Fellow, Anna Nemtsova. Anna began her reporting on crisis in the Northern Caucasus and Central Asia as a researcher for the Washington Post. Since then, she has worked as a reporter covering Russia for Western audiences and the West for Russia-speaking audiences. Currently, she is a Moscow-based correspondent for the Daily Beast, Newsweek magazine, and the Fuller Project for International Reporting, covering Russia and the former Soviet states. She also contributes her stories to Politico and foreign policy magazines, NBCnews.com, The Guardian, BBC, The Washington Post, Vanity Fair, and Marie Claire. In addition to being awarded the Meal Fellowship, Anna was the 2015 recipient of the IWMF Courage in Journalism Award. She focuses her reporting on human rights and social issues in post-Soviet states in Europe. And tonight, Anna will be talking about her recent Pulitzer-centered funded reporting on HIV/AIDS in Russia. UNAIDS calculates that between 2010 and 2015, Russia accounted for more than 80% of all new HIV infections in the entire Eastern European and Central Asian region, growing about 10% during that time period. At the same time, new infections in the rest of Europe and North America dropped by 9%. Russian authorities have long ignored the problem and missed opportunities to stem or slow the epidemic by rejecting or limiting proven harm reduction strategies, foreign aid, and access to medication. Anna and her fellow Pulitzer Center grantee, Sophia Jones, investigated this epidemic last year and reported on the intersection of HIV/AIDS and gender. They explored why women are being left behind in terms of diagnosis and treatment, and highlighted potential solutions to the HIV epidemic that are backed by research and have the potential to scale. I'm going to turn things over to Anna now and remind you that we will have time for question and answer, so if you have some questions, make sure you hold them for them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, and everybody for bringing me here, giving me a chance to meet with you. I come to the United States only once a year, so I really would like to hear later a lot of questions, because living in Moscow, we often lose the connection with the readers, with our readers. I came to this profession 20 years ago when the war in Chechnya began in Russia. I bought my own ticket and flew to Nazran, a small town in Ingushetia, on the borders with Chechnya. At that time, all of us reporters covering the war realized that we were needed there, whether we came from the United States, from Great Britain, whether we were foreign reporters or Russian reporters, we were needed. And that was a clear understanding both among the military, soldiers wanted to talk with us and tell us their story, and the local population, people who were suffering a lot from violence, from bombings, from shelling. And that was the era when Russia understood that journalists were needed, that journalism was important. Today is a different time. Today, we journalists are often seen as foreign agents if we come from foreign media. And it is very difficult sometimes to talk with people, especially on the record. And this era is the era of the information war. Both the information war fought by Russia in Eastern Europe, in the United States, in Ukraine, but also at home. And that's why it is important to understand that the HIV epidemic that I'm going to talk today about, it is one of the elements in this information war. And a lot of people fall victims of lack of information. They die as a result of the information war. So since the war in Chechnya, I have covered military conflicts in Georgia, in Northern Karabakh, in Ukraine, in Afghanistan. And everywhere covering the crisis, I realized that human rights story is my priority. That's why I go to cover the crisis, because I want to speak with people, and I have friends in this audience who come from Russia, and they remember the time when, during the war in Chechnya especially, women were suffering a lot. For me, portraits of women and women's stories are important, because through a woman, through her story, You can tell a lot about the country. You can tell a lot about the crisis, about domestic violence. I've covered many stories on domestic violence in Russia because my best friend, school friend, was killed by her husband in my hometown of Nizhny Novgorod. And that's when I wrote the story for Newsweek magazine about my friend Lena. So my stories are often personal. And this time I came to this project also because of a personal story, because a friend's friend, 49-year-old woman, a pediatrician, a doctor, 49 years old. You need to understand that in Russia there are many lonely women. There are at least 11 million more women than men, because women live longer lives than men. Men often divorce and find younger women, so women after 45 have problems finding men. So she's 49. She had sex with an electrician who came to her house to fix a lamp, and she got HIV. You're sent to a special center called AIDS Center, and there are AIDS centers in every Russian cities. In every big cities, there are these clinics. In some cities, these clinics look like prisons. They're very depressing, and in her town, her name is Natasha. We're now going to talk a little bit about Natasha's case. So she goes to this clinic, and I go with her. And when she comes out, I wait for her outside and in her friend's car. When she comes out, she's pale, and she says, "I'm never going back in. I don't have HIV, and I'm not going to think about it ever again." So she turned into an AIDS dissident, somebody who rejected the idea that she has the diagnosis. And there are many, thousands and thousands of people in Russia who always find something online, some article by some doctor who says there are no AIDS. AIDS do not exist. This is not a disease. It's all invented by Americans. So unfortunately, there are doctors like that, and I've done a story about HIV dissidents. Natasha right now is dying of cancer. We don't know if that cancer is related to her HIV diagnosis or not, but she refused to have therapy, to take therapy. And I started covering this issue 20 years ago, back in 2000, or even 99, the end of 99, when I still worked as a researcher and fixer for the Washington Post. We traveled to Irkutsk. It is a city in Siberia. Maybe you guys heard about Baikal Lake, so it's not far from Baikal. It is a beautiful city, but it just happened so that back in almost 30 years ago, heroin arrived from Afghanistan. So the heroin traffic, even today, goes from Afghanistan through Central Asia and Siberia to the center of Russia. So the first, let's say, parcel arrived in Irkutsk, and kids injected heroin at nightclubs with the same needle. And nobody knew back then what AIDS was, and nobody knew much about the disease. And for years and years, international groups tried to help Russia to battle, to fight the epidemic. So there were international groups for many years. They were called different names. There was Stop AIDS organization, and they provided people with free condoms, with free syringes, while police or state officials closed their eyes to the illegal drug trade in Russian cities. And that's what happened in Irkutsk. Thanks to Pulitzer Center, and thanks to the grant that I got from Pulitzer this year, I had a chance to return to Irkutsk for this story, for this project, and look at what has happened since I first started covering this issue. The first taxi driver I met, who was giving me a lift from the airport, tells me, "We have as much salt, bath salt, as snow." I asked him, "What? Bath salt? What is it?" "It's a drug that our kids use, and they inject it. You can buy bath salts. It's a Chinese synthetic drug. You can buy the drug at schools, or online, basically. They buy online. They call the secret places where they hide the drug zakladki. A kid gets 1,000 rubles for hiding the dose. Taxi drivers bring people to the zakladki, to the secret places all the time. I read news all the time, and even I didn't know much about bath salts and about zakladki when I came to Siberia, and I realized that lots of kids inject not only crocodile, that's a very scary drug that destroys your flesh, your body, but also this bath salts. I heard that American kids also use bath salts, but maybe it's a different formula. Maybe they smoke it here, but in Russia they inject. And that's the problem, because 49% of Russian HIV positive, 49% got HIV from drug use. And 51% contracted HIV from heterosexual sex. A lot of these people, a big percent, are older than 30. And when you speak with teenagers, with students, with school kids, it seems they know much more about safe sex than people in their 40s. Basically, with the epidemic that we see in Russia today, nobody should leave. Nobody who lives active sexual life should leave home without a condom in the pocket. But unfortunately, all the international groups that used to distribute free condoms and free syringes back in the 90s and early 2000s are gone from Russia. And many groups, NGOs that received foreign funding were condemned as foreign agents, informing people about the disease, about the epidemic. A majority of Russians still believe that you can only get HIV through drug use or if you're homosexual, but this is not true. 51% of more than 1 million population of HIV positive Russians contracted the virus from heterosexual sex. If you and I, now we discussed here what sort of strategy the Kremlin needs to battle, to win the battle, I'm sure we can come up to a very simple three-step strategy. Basically, all Russia needs is more finance for therapy, because out of 1 million, more than 1 million people with HIV, only about 200, 300,000 receive therapy. While in the world now, there is a common knowledge that everybody who gets diagnosed should get therapy. But in Russia, very often, either people do not believe that this disease exists, or the doctors tell them, oh, you're okay, your blood is fine, you can live with this for a while. And they continue to pass the virus. Methadone therapy was banned by authorities. That's another big issue. And as for this free distribution of condoms, we also hear that there are some officials and at the parliament, state deputies who think that kids should not be told to use condoms. Orthodox believers think that, you know, life without condoms is safe enough, which is not true any longer in Russia, because the epidemic is scary. Some experts say that it's worse than in African countries, because at least there the dynamic is better now. Russia gets 100,000 cases, more than 100,000 new cases every year. So to go back to the information war, last year 15,000 Russians died officially. More than 15,000 Russians died from HIV, but we don't know how many more died from HIV related or AIDS related, died from AIDS. I'm sorry. We don't know how many more people like Natasha, she's dying, her diagnosis is cancer now, but doctors in Nizhny Novgorod cannot tell her whether that cancer was caused by her HIV or not. She regrets a lot now that she did not agree to have free therapy that was provided. we helped her to get free therapy from Moscow. So I interviewed experts and doctors in St. Petersburg and Moscow for this project. And they all say that despite the rising number of the new HIV infections, Russia is not increasing the amount of HIV medication accessible to the public or ramping up health education efforts. The authorities claim that it's up to the parents to educate their children at home on the risks of unsafe sex and drug use. But HIV experts also say that's largely still not happening. Parents are not educating their children enough. So to wrap up my presentation, I would like to talk with you about the broad idea. To understand what Russia is now, right? To understand Russia better, we need to think about the dynamic propaganda machine. The Kremlin is open to criticize the United States, and we often hear criticism for United States on state television, or Ukraine, but not domestic issues. Vladimir Putin, President Putin, has not pronounced HIV/AIDS a single time in his public speeches. Prime Minister Medvedev did a few years ago. He spoke about the reform, but not the president. So the Kremlin controls the flow of information, both on the West and at home, but they cannot put up information defense against the disease, against HIV. HIV is free, right? And the problem is growing. There is no way to put up a propaganda defense against it. Russian democracy has been badly damaged, and there is no chance to choose governors any longer. No chance for people to choose mayors. And the Kremlin is watching, and Federal Security Service, they are watching the governors, and not people, not free press, not independent press. The last question I want to ask, it's more or less a rhetorical question for all of us. Who watches the watchers? Thank you very much.
I'm just curious, was it Natasha or Natalia, her name?
Full name is Natalia.
Natalia. She had cancer. Was this from HIV or was it from human papillomavirus?
Well, that's what in Nizhny Novgorod, her doctors do not tell her. That's the problem. You know, I will explain why she was so upset when she came out of that building. Because the doctor who opened her case asked her a question. Can I ask you to sign a paper that allows us to tell your family what disease you die from when you die? The thing is that stigma in Russia is unbelievable.
Well, obviously, they don't have HIPAA laws. But
right.
I just, there must be a lot more IV drug use in Russia because I grew up in the 80s.
More than 41%, you mean?
Yeah, well, I think the majority of it is. But in the 80s, when I was growing up, they had us convinced, you know, girl meets guy, we're all going to get AIDS. And I actually found out that in the 90s that having heterosexual sex, even with someone with HIV, it was actually amazingly lower.
Given the culture of secrecy and misinformation, can you talk us through some of the journalistic challenges you had on reporting this kind of story?
This kind of story actually is not too challenging because people are extremely open to you. There are lots of volunteers with HIV. They're not afraid of anything. And if we open, I will just show you my page. Just a moment. Where is it? We did open it. It's here. So, just to show you guys what I'm up to. This is my page on the Daily Beast. I welcome you all, readers. The Daily Beast has 22 million readers and a lot of stringers and reporters all over the world. So this is my today's story. Just came out. Our first politician, he's gay, and he has HIV. There's a lot of violence, and both from state police and from militia, from Cossacks and nationalists. I don't think he will actually run, but at least he's declared that he's a candidate, and he's the first gay man with HIV who has guts to participate, take part in the Kremlin-controlled election. Did I answer your question? No, I didn't. About the challenges. Sorry.
I'm just surprised because there must be stigma, right? I mean, there's so much stigma here.
So much stigma there. Yeah. I mean, that's why he's the only one.
Yeah.
In the country of 140 million, thousands of LGBT from LGBT community have left the country in 2013 or since 2013 when anti-gay propaganda law came out. People were scared, and people are scared today. And once you're diagnosed with HIV, even with this first efforts by the Kremlin to actually break that stigma, fight against it, there are efforts, and Dmitry Medvedev's wife, Svetlana Medvedeva, she is doing a lot now on this field. But some people say it's too late because, you know, thousands and thousands of people have died. As for the challengers, I face challengers in Northern Caucasus and in Ukraine. But as a freelancer, I don't feel pressure. Maybe I cannot go to the Kremlin because I don't have the Kremlin's accreditation, and I cannot interview inside the Kremlin, but I can always ask officials to give me interviews outside. And they do more and more because a lot of them are on sanctions, and a lot of them want their messages to go through, to get through.
Thank you.
Please. Hi. Please, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I'm not sure if this works. Turn it upside down. All right. Just want to ask you, since you've had the opportunity to live here, and you, obviously your English is beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much.
You don't mind my complimenting you on that.
Thank you.
But my question is, what's your perspective since you get to see, you said that there's so much negative publicity about the West in general. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about these days, particularly.
Okay. That's a very good question. Thank you very much. I've done series this year and last year. I've been working on series on people working on the Kremlin salary, of the Russian state salary in Eastern Europe. Russia Today, Sputnik, and other, people in media, and not only NGOs, who receive salaries from Moscow, but they work in Baltic countries, in Germany, in Eastern Europe, and Hungary. The West is very much different from what we remember it. You find pro-Putin parties, you find pro-Putin political movements in Eastern Europe, far-right movements. You hear the same narratives, both in Russia and on the West. The West is criticizing itself. But as for Russia, right now there's a good news. It's World Cup. Thousands of people have arrived from 32 countries, I believe. If you're in Siberia and you don't have the internet, you can be really scared after watching television for a few hours, thinking that the entire world is against Russia. My taxi driver in Irkutsk asked me, do you think we're okay here if the war begins? Like, what war? Oh, if not for Putin, we would have had the war. With who? I don't know with who, but with somebody. So people are worried. The Cold War is scary. Thanks to this football matches, people have a chance to mingle, to meet a lot of people from the world, from Latin America, from Europe, from America. And I hope that after this 1 month of football festival, there will be more understanding what the world is, some connection. Did I answer your question?
No, not really, but that's a good
Well,
a good
if you look at
sidebar.
statistics, majority of Russians are anti-American.
Mhm.
If United States is the West.
Okay.
Are they giving out free condoms at the World Cup?
That's a very good question. I did a story about girls waiting for the boys and looking for husbands and boyfriends. And when I reported that story in Sochi, one of the State Duma deputies, Tamara, what's her name? I don't remember her last name. She said, I don't recommend Russian women to have sex with foreign visitors because their children are going to be unhappy, just like the children were unhappy after Olympic Games in 1980. So this is a myth that children were unhappy after 1980. There were a lot of foreign students in Soviet Union. And, but there is still this myth that after 1980 there was a big baby boom in Soviet Union.
Just going back to the AIDS conversation, you
Thank you.
mentioned that there was a lot of misinformation about AIDS even existing. Can you describe more how that's spreading and where that's coming from and how prominent it actually is?
So I visited the AIDS center in Irkutsk and did a story about that clinic. It is the best clinic in Russia. This year it was recognized as absolutely best. The equipment is great and the personnel are beautiful. The head of the clinic is a woman with very progressive views, and she came to this field when Irkutsk was #1 on the number of people with AIDS. So, but next to that building there is a big cancer hospital, and in that hospital there is still a doctor who tells her patients just across the road that there is no HIV. This is all a myth. What to do about it? One doctor was fired. While I was reporting, one doctor was fired for her propaganda on the internet, anti-HIV, whatever you call it, propaganda, ignorance basically. But since there's so little information in general, and the Kremlin is not talking enough about the epidemic, people still live with stigma, I would say. Yeah. Tamara Plitneva, да. The deputy's name.
So, in your reporting, from a social justice perspective, whatever the policy, national policy might be about access to HIV treatment, there are a lot of rich Russians who I'm sure, regardless of their distrust, probably have access to standard of care antiretroviral therapy. So I'd be interested in how you had reported on the difference between those who can and can't access. And then just to the point about the football, when South Africa hosted the World Cup, it was a real opportunity for not only a region but a country that is at the center of the epidemic to really do good health education, health promotion, which they absolutely embraced.
Thank
so
you.
I just wanted to
Thank you very much for this. What is your name?
My name is Yasmin.
Yasmin, very nice to meet you. Yes, I did speak with rich Russians with HIV, and Anton is one of them. You actually can buy therapy over the counter, yeah, and because of the reform, at least one medicine is much cheaper than it used to be, so they really cut down on the price, but they stopped importing stuff as a result of the sanctions. So some of the pills are made in Russia, and you open the box and they're falling apart, they're into pieces. So I know Russians with HIV who go to London and sometimes get the package for free when they arrive in the airport. That's what you get when you arrive in Great Britain, which is probably unfair a little bit, but look, everybody's thinking about the future, obviously. There is a really good center, and I wrote about, one of my stories is about a perfect center that is very progressive, but it is in Moscow region, not even in Moscow city. So the Moscow region AIDS center is probably the best in Russia today. Well, the Irkutsk one is also great, but if you live in Nizhny Novgorod, like my friend Natasha, you need to have registration in Moscow region in order to receive treatment in that clinic. So she can come and see the doctors, but she cannot have her file there. So there's a lot of bureaucracy, a very complicated system, and there is no legislation. So, to answer your question.
Hi. So I'm also working on a story for the Pulitzer Center, and yeah, it's an amazing organization, and I'm so grateful, and it's just amazing to come here and hear about your
Thank you.
reporting. That's all.
Good luck with your project.
Thank you. But I am also writing something that is based on a friend, someone that I know very well. And so I'm interested in hearing about your experience of doing that and how you kind of like toe the line between being a journalist and being a friend, and at what point you show your work to Natasha, if you do at all, and just how you go.
Oh, Natasha is not in the condition to think of my work today, but I've done tons of stories about friends. Tons and tons. If we go scroll down, we can scroll here. I'll show you a very important story. This is the story that is very important for me. Natasha Estemirova was killed in Chechnya. She was our good friend. And her daughter was a teenager. How old was she? 14. She was 14. And she decided that she leaves Russia, goes away from Chechnya, and never comes back to that republic. And at the time, she did not think of becoming a human rights defender like her mother. Her mother was a hero human rights defender. When she was killed, I flew on the day I found out to Grozny to be at her funeral. And I wrote my piece for foreign policy, first person. Foreign policy welcomed that. To answer your question, you know, it depends on the publication. For years, I was publishing a column called Putinology with foreign policy. They welcomed first-person stories, and Politico did too. But if you want it to be less personal and to keep it distant from your friend and to just a traditional journalistic piece, which is also great, and I personally prefer that. Ask her if she wants to be on the record, if she wants her name. Natasha didn't want her last name to be mentioned, of course. It's understandable. Oh, I didn't finish. I'm sorry. The girl is now going to be a great human rights defender. Her voice is very strong, and if you guys are interested, please read the story, because we're very proud of this girl. She graduated from a school in Oxford and then went to London School of Economics, and now she's a well-educated, beautiful young woman who talks a lot about LGBT being tortured, kidnapped, you know, imprisoned in Chechnya, about human rights activists suffering from political repression. So she's great. Had a chance to talk about her.
So I'm curious about, through your reporting on this issue of HIV in Russia, and we've learned that the Russian federal government is not as responsive as they should be. Have you encountered any grassroots organizations or Russian nonprofits on the ground who do educational campaigns, maybe kind of unofficially? And if so, how are they perceived, and have you been able to get in touch with them?
Absolutely. What is your name?
Aishwarya.
Aishwarya, very nice to meet you. So there is a beautiful NGO called AIDS Center. Once again, they use the same name, except that they put a full stop. AIDS, full stop center.
Okay.
That's their only difference from clinics. But they have a cool place in Moscow where they provide mostly young people, because I'm not sure why. Probably they don't have enough advertisement. All the information about them is online. So many young people come to the center, and they receive psychological support, information about their health condition, their doctors giving free consultancy, and they can even get medication there. So it is a very nice place, a great NGO. I'm very proud of them. But there are not many, and there are not, obviously not enough groups. Some volunteers I met in Siberia, in St. Petersburg, in Nizhny Novgorod, they're all HIV positive. Whether they receive money from the state or from some foreign organization, I don't know. We don't talk about it. This is not a safe place for people these days.
Anna, thank you. Thanks so much. Anna, thank you for your wonderful reporting, important reporting. I'm grasping at straws in thinking of how the situation could be improved in Russia. I want to ask you, way back when, at the beginning of Russia's Afghan war, it seemed that the government tried to tamp down knowledge of the war and deaths and so on and so forth, and that was a period of time, maybe not at all analogous, maybe it is analogous. And then eventually enough people were impacted that it broke through, right?
Thanks to soldiers' mothers.
That's exactly right,
Part of
yeah.
it.
Now, so it seems as if the stigma is fighting against the percentage of people who are affected, and so my awful question is the percentage of infection, has it topped off, or is it continuing to rise?
It's rising. It's scary to see how it's
And then
rising.
as it continues to rise, would you then imagine that even, is that where the breaking point is with the stigma? I mean, we don't want to wait. We want to report and shout it out, but you know what I mean? What I'm asking?
Yeah. I think that authorities now realize that this is the time to hurry up and to, reach out to people. There are campaigns, staged campaigns all across the country. Like last month, every Russian university had some classes about safe sex and, about HIV. But the main doctor, number one, Dr. Pokrovsky, he's the head of Moscow AIDS Center. He said maybe it's too late to talk to the university students because in Russia, girls, for instance, start having sex at age 15. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, school kids use drugs and they inject drugs. So where do you start? At what point? You need to speak with school kids, right? So they're still falling behind. It took years, you're right, during the war in Afghanistan, it took years, and the civil society was very active, much more active and braver than now.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So you mentioned that 49% of the people living with HIV contracted it from drug injection and the other 51% from heterosexual sex. So I'm wondering how...
there's still a little percent of homosexuals.
Okay.
But it's so tiny that I cannot even see officials talking about it. This is not.
Right. So my question is what your experience has been, especially working with women, in regards to women, gay women who have contracted HIV, especially in the midst of the anti-gay propaganda.
Well, see, none of the girls that I spoke with were gay, or at least they didn't tell me. This is a complete difference. Fear. Russia is full of fear. I did not mention that a lot of these people have been to prison, because in Russia you go to jail if you use drugs or if you have drugs on you. And sometimes, not sometimes, a huge population in prison are there for drugs. A huge part of prison population is there for drugs. So most of these girls manage to stop injecting because they spend time in prison. Their stories, each one of them. In Siberia, so one of my stories for the Pulitzer Center project is about women on drugs in Siberia. They've been through hell. They've had it all. They have hepatitis, they have HIV, they have wounds from crocodile. And one of them said, I found many icons in my mother's bedroom. And behind one of these icons, I found pieces of paper, her prayers for me. She was on drugs for 12 years, and her mother did not hope she would survive. So many people died. It's a dark story. I'm sure it's just as dark here, so.
Are you a staff writer for the Daily Beast or a freelancer?
I'm a correspondent for the Daily Beast in Moscow, and they're only correspondent in former Soviet Union, in this former Soviet states.
Can you talk about what the support of the Pulitzer Center meant and what it allowed you to do that you might not have been able to do otherwise?
A lot of us foreign reporters working in Russia, we overdo it with Putin-Trump madness. We have to, because this is news, right? And this is our job. But the HIV project allowed me to go to Siberia, to look out of this box, right? Because we are focused on the Kremlin's politics a lot. So it is a different window, and I'm very grateful that it was open for me. Thank you.
Actually, I have a, I guess, sort of related question
Okay.
to that. Is there any opportunity for you to publish these type of stories in Russian for Russians?
Absolutely, yeah.
and,
Or
take
I
this
can go on
material?
Echo of Moscow and speak about it, or there are still a few publications where I could publish online mostly, and a few newspapers, a couple, right? We have an expert here, Natasha. She knows everything about Russian media, but you know, I did not mention that that was my third project with the Pulitzer Center. And the previous two projects are still very much acute too. So if you think I should publish it in Russian, see, I'm reluctant not because of my fear or the pressure on free press. I think I write better in English than in Russian, honestly.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
sharing your knowledge. Because it's such a taboo in Russia about HIV and AIDS, how much study has been given to women who give birth to children who possibly have the disease?
Yes, this is a very good question, and we did spend a lot of time thinking about women and children, because now, you know, the only way authorities know to make women give therapy to children, and there are lots of pregnant women who do not want to use therapy because they're worried about damaging their future baby. Through court, the authorities take women to court, and there are many, many cases around Russian provinces when women lose, of course. They're forced by law to give therapy to their babies. And I must say that if the epidemic is huge in the area that I talked about, it's much less percent. I think they almost beat that problem. They won. So there are not so many women giving birth to HIV positive babies as it used to be. So there's some positive angle here. I'm not sure if this is the way to do it, the only way to do it, to take women to court, but that's what they do.
You mentioned that Putin doesn't speak publicly about HIV/AIDS and few government officials do. How does that affect the government surveillance from like a health services perspective to determine the need of treatment, regardless of prevention efforts, but to make sure that there's the right treatment available at the right quantities in the right regions, depending on rates of the cases and what medicine people need?
So Russian power institutions each have their own roles, right? So if Putin doesn't speak about HIV, Prime Minister Medvedev does, and Ministry of Health talk about it a lot. So the ministry is in charge of that war on HIV, on AIDS.
And are they effective in making sure that there's access, or?
They're not effective if you look at the numbers, and the epidemic is just getting worse. So they're not effective for a number of reasons.
And going off of that, as in the U.S., popular culture played a big role in the acceptance of people of HIV/AIDS, whether it be Magic Johnson coming out and saying that he had HIV, or celebrities wearing AIDS ribbons, or movies like Philadelphia. Is there anything equivalent to that going on in Russia, where you see popular figures who are speaking out that are, getting this message across to the public?
I would say that Trainspotting, the British movie, was very popular in Russia, but there was no analog made in Russia. And in general, there's even a big taboo on the drug traffic and illegal drug trade and these issues. I'm not a big television person, but I haven't heard about any TV series on illegal drug trade or, drug addiction. Unfortunately, that is not happening. And transporting did play a serious role in Great Britain for the culture, for the drug use culture, as far as I know. We need these movies.
I have just one question.
Yes, please.
It's about corruption. Did you, while doing your investigation, identify any cases of corruption going on with the drugs, with the money which government give to these needs and which don't go?
Well, I spent several years covering drug traffics with the Institute of Power called Drug Control Ministry. That used to be a special ministry, Drug Control Ministry, and Viktor Ivanov was the minister. So I first traveled with them to Afghanistan just to see what they're doing about the traffic of Afghan heroin to Russia, and then to China and Latin America. Just to answer your question, a couple years ago, the Kremlin closed down that ministry. So the division that is fighting drug traffic is now within the ministry, Interior Ministry. I'm sure there's a lot of corruption. And during the years I was focusing on the issue and publishing story after story with Newsweek, my interviews with Ivanov, he complained actually about different law enforcement agencies controlling drug traffic, whether it's Federal Security Service that gets more money now, or diplomats. I have no idea. I'm not investigating drug traffic currently, but it is a huge story, and it's very important to talk about it, definitely.
Thank you so much. If we can all give a round of applause for Anna for her amazing talk. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for coming to the Pulitzer Center tonight. And I want to remind you that we actually have a free ebook on To End AIDS that collects a number of our HIV AIDS projects in it. You can download it for free on iTunes, Amazon, or view it for free online. It's interactive, there's videos, there's photo galleries, and so I've got information on how to download it right up here. And then in addition to Sophia's wonderful reporting on HIV/AIDS, we have a number of people who have worked on HIV/AIDS topics, including just within the last few weeks, a project that came out in Science Magazine on PBS NewsHour that covers not only Russia and what's going on in Russia right now, but also in Florida and in Nigeria. And so I encourage you to check that out if you also want more information, and to check out Anna's other projects that are all available on the Pulitzer Center website as well. So, and please, can you join me in one more round of applause for Anna?